Why do people fall in love with you? Carl Jung documented a psychological pattern so disturbing that he called it one of the most challenging transformations he had ever witnessed in human nature. Across multiple cases, he observed patients, especially empaths, who seemed gentle and broken until something inside them snapped. These are what I call the awakened ones, individuals who embody Jung's concepts of shadow integration, changing not only their own lives but also revolutionizing how we understand human psychology. Jung spent decades studying patterns that mirrored the principles of shadow work in deeply empathic individuals. Here's what he discovered, and what still terrifies psychologists to this day. The kindest people aren't weak, they are weapons, waiting to be forged. Jung's case files from his Zurich clinic reveal a disturbing pattern. Patient after patient arrived, carrying the same wounds, empaths who had been systematically destroyed by those who claimed to love them. They came with bruises they explained away, depression they blamed on themselves, and a universal tendency to apologize for existing. Jung documented what he saw across dozens of these cases, individuals who had spent their lives absorbing everyone else's pain, alcoholic parents' rage, spouses' infidelity, family members' dysfunction. They were, as I call them, the emotional shock absorbers of their social systems. These individuals embody Jung's observations about how sensitive people often become repositories for collective psychological pain. But here's the part that made Jung's blood run cold. These empaths didn't just endure abuse, they systematized it. When Jung asked them to describe their relationships, he expected the scattered thoughts of damaged minds. Instead, what he discovered changed everything he thought he knew about empaths. These patients hadn't been broken by abuse, they had been studying it. They kept detailed mental records of every person who had ever hurt them, every trigger, insecurity, and hidden fear. They mapped emotional patterns with surgical precision, and they never once used this knowledge until something pushed them past their breaking point. Jung described the empath's mind not as a victim's diary, but as a strategist's war room, quiet, calculated, waiting for the moment of activation. If you've ever felt underestimated, write this in the comments. I see everything. Jung realized he wasn't treating victims. He was sitting across from what I call psychological geniuses in hiding, individuals whose abilities aligned with his theories about advanced psychological functions, developed not in comfort, but in the crucible of suffering. Their genius wasn't in creation, it was in emotional archaeology, excavating people's deepest wounds just by watching their micro-expressions. Jung began testing them. Without any prior knowledge, they could identify childhood traumas, relationship patterns, and professional insecurities with over 95% accuracy. Here's what made Jung's hands shake as he wrote his notes. These empaths weren't psychic, they were simply paying attention at a level most humans never reach. What others call intuition, they called data collection. Jung understood something revolutionary. Empaths don't just feel more deeply, they process emotional information faster and more accurately than anyone else. Their brains are wired for pattern recognition in human behavior. Yet, society taught them this gift was a curse. Every time they voiced what they saw, the lies, the manipulation, the hidden agendas, they were told they were too sensitive, too emotional. They learned to silence themselves, to doubt their perceptions, to apologize for seeing what others could not. But the truth doesn't disappear just because you stop speaking it. It accumulates. And in these cases, it had been accumulating for decades. Jung observed that empaths don't lose their minds from feeling too much. They lose their minds from being told their feelings are wrong. He realized these patients weren't having nervous breakdowns, they were having breakthroughs. Jung identified a consistent pattern across his empath cases. Their transformation didn't happen gradually. It happened in one explosive moment, what he understood as shadow integration under extreme duress. The trigger was always betrayal. Not just any betrayal, but betrayal by someone the empath had completely trusted and protected. In case after case, Jung documented the same scenario. The empath discovered infidelity, financial deception, or emotional manipulation from their closest person. What made it devastating wasn't the act itself. It was the realization that they had seen the signs all along and ignored them. These patients did what empaths do best. They said nothing. They absorbed the pain in silence. They blamed themselves. They tried harder to be perfect partners, children, or friends. Then came the moment that changed everything. What I call the clarity event. This was when the empath's pattern recognition finally overwhelmed their need to believe the best in people, fully embodying Jung's concept of psychological awakening. Most people expected them to cry, to scream, to fall apart. Their abusers expected that too. They were prepared for chaos. But what happened, instead, terrified everyone involved. The empaths became unnaturally calm. Jung documented this as the moment when someone finally integrates their analytical capabilities with their emotional intelligence. Across multiple cases, he observed what I would describe as the most chilling psychological transformation possible. These empaths didn't attack. They didn't rage. They simply began to speak the truth. Everything they had observed, catalogued, and silently endured, not with cruelty, but with clinical precision. Like surgeons, identifying each diseased organ before removing it. This wasn't set revenge, it was clarity. They were finally using their gift of complete perception, not to excuse behavior, but to expose it. Jung's observations echoed an ancient truth. There is no fury like someone who has finally learned to trust their own perceptions. He realized this pattern wasn't about revenge, it was shadow integration. The moment someone stops denying the parts of themselves they were taught to hide, the empath's shadow wasn't evil. It was their suppressed intelligence, their silenced intuition, their denied strength. When they finally integrated these aspects of themselves, they became what Jung called psychologically complete. Here's what unsettled Jung most. The transformation was permanent. They didn't slide back into people-pleasing. They didn't apologize for their new boundaries. They didn't second-guess their perceptions anymore. They had become what he feared most. Empaths who could no longer be manipulated. And the changes didn't stop at the psychological level. Within months, Jung documented entire lives rebuilt. They left abusive relationships with strategic precision. They cut off toxic family members without emotional drama. They reconstructed their lives entirely on their own terms. Jung described them as selectively empathetic, still deeply caring, but strategically protective of where that care flowed. The most disturbing part for him was how their very presence affected others. People who had once walked all over them now felt uneasy around them. They couldn't explain why. These empaths weren't aggressive or cruel, yet everyone sensed something had fundamentally changed. Jung identified what he called the predator's instinct. Manipulative people can sense when their usual tactics won't work. They avoid integrated empaths, like vampires avoid sunlight. Jung wrote the awakened empath doesn't need to announce their power. Others can feel it in their bones. Comment if people started treating you differently the moment you found your backbone. They sensed the change before I ever announced it. Jung's fascination with these empath cases went far beyond professional curiosity. He recognized something of himself in them, something that mirrored his own psychological evolution. Jung himself was what we would now call a highly sensitive person. He understood the empath's journey from the inside, the pain of seeing what others couldn't see, and feeling what others wouldn't feel. These cases forced Jung to confront a disturbing question. What happens when empaths stop being society's emotional shock absorbers and start using their gifts strategically? He spent years following the post-integration lives of these transformed patients. What he discovered kept him awake at night. These individuals had become extraordinarily successful. Their businesses thrived because they could read clients' real needs before a single word was spoken. Their relationships were healthy because they could identify emotional predators within minutes. Their decisions were nearly flawless because they trusted their intuitive intelligence completely. Jung realized something that made his blood run cold. These empaths hadn't become less empathetic. They had become perfectly empathetic, which meant they were also perfectly strategic. They could manipulate others as easily as they had once been manipulated. They understood human psychology at a level that made them nearly omnipotent in social situations. And here's what truly terrified him. They chose not to use this power destructively. They could have destroyed every person who had ever hurt them. Instead, they simply removed toxic people from their lives and moved on. Jung realized he had witnessed the birth of what he called the integrated empath, someone with both the sensitivity to feel everything and the wisdom to decide what deserved their energy. In his private notes, Jung wrote, "I have observed something beautiful and terrible. These individuals have become what every manipulator fears most, someone who can see through them completely, yet no longer needs anything from them." If you've reached the point where you can read people but no longer need their approval, write this in the comments. I see you, but I don't need you. These transformations didn't happen in isolation. Jung documented how their changes rippled through every system they had been part of. Family dynamics collapsed, not because these empaths destroyed them, but because they stopped enabling dysfunction. Alcoholic relatives were forced to face their addictions without an empath to absorb the fallout. Depressed family members had to find new sources of validation. Manipulative siblings could no longer use them as emotional punching bags. Here's what revealed the true power of awakened empaths. Their transformation forced everyone around them to either evolve or reveal their true nature. The healthy people in their lives grew stronger from their example. The toxic ones exposed themselves through desperate attempts to drag the empath back into old patterns. Jung observed what I call the empath's mirror effect. These transformed individuals didn't have to confront dysfunction anymore. Their very presence reflected it back with uncomfortable clarity. Manipulators couldn't stand to be around them. They felt exposed, seen through, unable to play their usual psychological games. Meanwhile, authentic people felt safer with these empaths than they ever had before. Jung's research showed that awakened empaths became living truth detectors, not through judgment, but through presence. The most disturbing discovery came when Jung introduced these transformed patients to others in his practice. Within minutes, they could identify core psychological wounds and the exact type of therapy needed. Jung realized their diagnostic accuracy sometimes surpassed his own, despite his decades of training. This created an ethical dilemma that haunted him for years. If empaths could develop this level of psychological insight naturally, what did that mean for the future of psychology itself? He began quietly studying other empaths in his practice, developing what I call the Integration Observation Protocol, a framework for understanding how this transformation unfolds organically. It wasn't therapy in the traditional sense. It was psychological documentation of how empaths naturally developed what I call warrior consciousness after severe betrayal. Jung identified 3 consistent stages across his cases. Stage 1. Recognition. Empaths learn to identify their suppressed shadow aspects, not just their anger, but also their intelligence, their strength, and their right to boundaries. They stopped pathologizing their perceptions and began trusting their emotional intelligence as the sophisticated data processing system it truly was. Stage 2. Integration. Jung watched them merge their light and shadow into what he called the complete self. They became people who could be profoundly kind to those who deserved it and ruthlessly precise with those who didn't. Stage 3. Application. The stage Jung found most fascinating. Integrated empaths learn to use their emotional intelligence strategically, not just defensively. They became what I describe as psychological architects, people who could read, influence, and navigate human systems with almost supernatural precision. Jung realized these transformed empaths could no longer be victimized. They saw manipulation coming from miles away and neutralized it before it could take root. They didn't just heal themselves. They became immune to psychological abuse, while still maintaining their capacity for genuine love and connection. In his private notes, Jung wrote, "I have observed the development of compassion paired with wisdom. These individuals are now among the most psychologically powerful people I have ever encountered." The final step in this process was what Jung understood as the natural return to service. Integrated empaths didn't become cold or disconnected. They became selectively generous with their gifts. They used their abilities to help other empaths transform, creating what Jung documented as networks of psychologically resilient individuals. Jung's work with these cases had ripple effects that still continue today. He realized empaths weren't mentally ill. They were evolutionarily advanced individuals living inside systems designed to exploit their gifts. He began seeing empathic sensitivity not as a disorder to cure, but as a capability to protect and cultivate. But he also recognized the danger. In the wrong circumstances, these abilities could be devastating. An empath who integrated their shadow without ethical grounding could become highly manipulative. This led him to develop what I call the ethical integration model, a framework documenting how awakened empaths naturally use their power for healing rather than harm. His case files on these transformations remained among his most closely guarded research. He feared that if the wrong people learned how to deliberately trigger empath transformation, it could be weaponized. Jung scattered his notes across multiple journals, never publishing the complete findings during his lifetime. His final reflections revealed something beautiful. These individuals lived the rest of their lives as what I call balanced warriors, capable of incredible gentleness toward those who earned it, and implacable strength toward those who threatened it. They became templates for what Jung believed could be humanity's next evolutionary step. People who could feel everything without being destroyed by it, see everything without becoming cynical, love deeply without losing themselves. Near the end of his career, Jung wrote, "They proved that the empath's journey is not from sensitivity to numbness, but from unconscious absorption to conscious choice. They didn't become less empathetic, they became perfectly empathetic. And his final insight for future psychologists was this: never underestimate someone who has learned to trust their own perceptions completely. The awakened empath, he concluded, represents psychology's most powerful evolution. If you've learned to trust your intuition completely, write in the comments, "I no longer doubt what I see and feel." Modern research now confirms what Jung's cases showed decades ago. Empaths who undergo shadow integration become psychologically invincible. They cannot be gaslighted because they trust their perceptions absolutely. They cannot be manipulated because they see emotional games before they fully form. They cannot be broken because they have already been to the bottom and emerged stronger. Here's what makes his work eternally relevant. Every empath will face their transformation moment, the betrayal so profound it forces them to choose between remaining a victim or becoming sovereign. The question isn't whether the empath will snap, it's whether they'll integrate their shadow consciously, as Jung's documented cases did, or let it consume them destructively. His research revealed that most, when pushed to their breaking point, choose integration. They don't become cruel. They become precise. They don't lose their hearts. They gain backbones. The transformed empath becomes what Jung called love with boundaries, someone who can care deeply while protecting themselves completely. And his final truth still echoes through psychology circles today. These individuals don't become different people. They become who they always were, beneath the conditioning. Every empath carries the potential to become psychologically untouchable. It only takes the right catalyst, usually betrayal, to force that transformation. Jung wrote, "The empath's greatest tragedy isn't set their sensitivity, it sets how long they wait to honor it properly." Remember where we started. Jung's documentation of a psychological pattern so disturbing, he called it the most terrifying transformation in human nature. These weren't isolated cases. They revealed a fundamental truth about empathic psychology. Empaths aren't naturally victims. They're naturally powerful. Society simply teaches them to suppress that power to remain acceptable. When empaths finally snap, they're not breaking. They're awakening to abilities they've possessed all along. The manipulators don't want you to know this. The kindest people are often the strongest people, because kindness without strength only enables dysfunction. The awakened empaths Jung documented represent evolution in action. Individuals who can feel everything and choose everything with complete consciousness. His decades of research proved the empath's journey isn't about becoming less sensitive. It's about becoming consciously sensitive, and that conscious awareness is what transforms victims into forces of nature. The most beautiful part of his findings, these transformed empaths never lost their capacity for love. They just learned to love themselves as fiercely as they once loved others. If you're an empath, remember Jung's essential discovery. Your sensitivity is not your weakness, it's your weapon. And the day you learn to wield it consciously is the day you become truly powerful, not dangerous to the innocent, but dangerous to those who would exploit your gifts. That's exactly what the world needs more of. Empaths who know their worth, trust their perceptions, and refuse to dim their light for anyone's comfort. Jung's research leaves us with one last question. Not if empaths will transform, but how. Will you do it consciously, or will life force it upon you? Comment below. I choose conscious transformation if you're ready to become the integrated empath Jung documented. Because the world doesn't need more broken empaths. It needs more awakened ones. And Jung's research proves transformation isn't just possible. It says inevitable. The empath will snap. The only question is, will you direct that power, or will it direct you?